For full context, go and watch my first video on Futo. But to catch up to speed, last week I did a video on the organization, or more specifically, when they released Futo's the open source definition. Now, when this definition came out, this led to a blog post from Dan Brown, the developer of Bookstack, who was very, very critical over their use of the term. Following that, I made my own video where I also had my own concerns, and the main issue is how their definition of open source conflicts with the conventionally used definition. Now, to my pleasant surprise, this led to a response from both Louis Rossmann, who left a giant comment on my video. It's on the screen right now. It's kind of an essay. And also there'll be an episode of Tech for Tea with Michael from Futo, where we go over everything involved in the organization and also the new direction they're going, because that is the important part. After all of this went down, they also released another statement, the Futo statement on open source. So let's see where we stand today and where we are going. Now, apparently the previous piece they posted, Futo's the open source definition, this was supposed to be parody and poking fun at the open source initiatives, the open source definition, that being this one here. Now, when I read through this, there was nothing in here that indicated to me that this was supposed to be parody. Now, I'm not saying they're lying here. I think this is just a really bad attempt at doing parody. Knowing now that it's supposed to be parody, I think maybe the opening line is supposed to be what indicates it. Open source just means access to the source code. This is a direct negation of the opening line of the open source definition. Open source doesn't just mean access to the source code. I think the reason why that doesn't work is this is something people often say in absolute sincerity, thinking that that is what open source means. For the record, I don't think parody is bad. I just think there needs to be some sort of indication it actually is parody. Not necessarily rendered on the page, even if it's just like a comment in the page HTML, for example, that I think is enough to at least be an indication. Fundamentally, our goals are to build great products that don't abuse people, beat the tech oligopoly, and elevate the rights of programmers developing the software that has source code open to public scrutiny and tinkering. In order to change the culture around software to make this a reality, top-tier software engineers need to make a living money creating good open source software. There are a couple of mistakes in the write-up. I think they're supposed to say a living wage creating good open source software. Whether or not you agree with the way they're approaching this, this is one of the biggest issues that exist in the FOSS world. Outside of the people that spend just every single waking hour working on their software, most FOSS developers do incredible work during high school, maybe university, and then maybe a little bit outside of that, and then realize, wait, I have rent to pay, I have bills to pay, and then have to go get a job at some regular development firm that doesn't give them time to work on open source software. So the problem we have is that so many talented developers are lost because they are just not able to make FOSS sustainable. Now, don't get me wrong, there are absolutely people out there who make it work. Whether they just are happy making not that much money, but they get to spend all of their time working on something they really enjoy, or they're happy to spend all of their free time just working on this software. But I can't really fault anyone who leaves this space because they just have other priorities. We don't want the top 1% programmers to think they need to work at Facebook or Google to pay for gas while working on passion projects in their spare time. We want to cultivate a culture where those passion projects can be their full-time job. Again, I hope everybody can agree with this goal, even if you don't end up liking the way they're trying to do it. We fully support the work of groups like the Free Software Foundation and have donated to them directly. We have also donated millions of dollars to various FOSS projects, many of which are listed on our site. Certain aspects of our own products, RayJ plugins for example, are licensed as GPL code. This is something I probably should have included in my first video, but my focus was more on the definition they were putting forth. So apologies for anyone who sort of misconstrued what I was saying. They're thinking that they just don't have any interest in donating to these projects, because if we look on their website, moving past their actual internal projects, they've donated money to the Tor project, to things like VLC, Darktable, Blender, FFmpeg, PeerTube, GitLab, GIMP, Asahi Linux, and a bunch of other projects. Now we move into the core part of the first video. Our use of the term open source thus far has not been out of carelessness, but out of disdain for OSI-approved licenses, which nevertheless allow developers to be exploited by large corporate interests. The OSI, an organization with confidential charter members and large corporate sponsors, does not have any legal right to say what is and is not open source. It is arrogant of them to lay claim to the definition. Now, back in 1999, the OSI did attempt to get a trademark for the term open source, and they failed to do so because the term had already been in use for a number of years prior to that. Now, they did acquire a trademark for open source initiative approved license, but not the open source part by itself. There is a reason these licenses and the organizations affiliated with them have the support of Google, Microsoft, Apple, and other giants. Corporate interests benefit directly from the field of endeavor criteria within the OSI definition of open source. At Futo, we fully believe that these kinds of licenses have failed to properly protect developers and community members from being exploited. So we've all heard situations like Color.js and various other projects which turn into protestware because the developer just feels like they are not being adequately funded for the work they do and for how important this piece of software now is to just keeping things running. Now, this field of endeavor criteria basically means that in an open source license, you can't discriminate against the kind of use case for that software. So you can't say, I don't want this software being used in a military context, or I don't want this software being used in a corporate context, and things like that. Every single use case for the software is treated equally. Now, that doesn't mean you have to actively support it, or you can't actively add things into the software that make that use case worse, but if somebody wants to use the software in that use case, you cannot stop them. Now, I absolutely think the culture around funding projects does need to improve, but I think what is very important to remember is when you make a project, nobody is forcing specific license terms on you. If you fork a project, that's different, but I mean, if you start a project from scratch, you can use the license that you want to use. And assuming that you understand the terms of that license, you should be going into this decision knowing what to expect, knowing what you can do with the software, and knowing what other people can do with the software. So, whilst I do think that people should better fund the projects they're using, if you choose to use an open source license, and then a company like, I don't know, Google, Amazon, Facebook, something like that, makes use of your library and never gives anything back, this is obviously not what they should be doing, but it is in the terms of the license that you chose to use. Now, whilst they may take issues with the OSI, the people that really matter here are the developers that actually are trying to write code and the people they are trying to benefit by making this change. The community has told us that open source has a particular meaning to them and suggested we call it source available instead. We have been reluctant to do so for numerous reasons. Source available is not a real licensing standard and is so wildly generalized that it applies to free software, open source software, and in some cases, even proprietary software. So in the case of something like the Microsoft Office suite, you can pay Microsoft a lot of money and then get access to the source code, but it can only be used within the terms of that license, which is usually just a very small group of people. And they can reject the license at any time. You cannot distribute this software. You cannot fork this software. It's a very, very specific use case it can be used for. Many codebases deemed to be source available have extreme restrictions on everyday users' ability to access and modify software. Often, source available licenses require users to pay to access source code and then restrict the distribution of it to paying organizations. These restrictions do not apply to our software whatsoever. Using such an overly broad catch-all category that applies to nearly anything does not adequately inform people about what they can and cannot do with our software. So looking at something like GreyJ Core License 1.0, for the most part, this is an open source license. The main thing that gets in the way of that is this line right here. You may distribute the software or provide it to others only if you do so free of charge for non-commercial purposes. But the rest of what we have here basically is open source. So if you call this source available has a lot of negative baggage to it. It's companies that are pretending to be open source. It's the weird thing that Microsoft does. I would not want to do something like what they are doing at Futo and then call it source available and have to deal with people just being even more confused about what you're trying to do. From the way that I see it, Futo is sort of this third option. So you have open source and then free software, and then also this thing that Futo has, which is kind of like open source, but not really. It's sort of open source adjacent. Thus, we've been calling our software open source. Our goal has never been to start semantic arguments about definitions. Now, the problem is the whole existence of open source and free software is about semantic arguments over definitions. There is a reason why there is a series of dot points that lays out exactly what each of these terms mean. Like, you will never escape the semantic arguments here. It is from the very foundation of these terms. The problem is that we didn't just stick a fork in the OSI's eye. We stuck one in yours, the wider community who abide by this definition. We understand that, and we're changing. We'll use the term source first instead for our projects. We believe this is a fair compromise. Now, in my first video, I had proposed working with the guys over at Faircode. I feel like Faircode basically encapsulates what they're trying to do here, and there is still some discussion at Futo about maybe going and doing that. They're not completely settled on absolutely using the term source first. At this stage, though, this is what they're doing, and a big part of the reason why they're doing that is so they can trademark it. Now, you might ask, why trademark it? Well, it avoids the whole problem we have with open source, where the definition that a lot of people use is the OSI's definition, but open source existed prior to the OSI, so there are other definitions of the term that exist, and it also has a less technical usage where it basically just means source available. You avoid that problem by being the person that defines what the term means, by being the person that owns the term. And to the best of my knowledge, there doesn't seem to be any other usage of the term source first, so I don't see any reason why doing this should be a problem. Maybe you're annoyed that another term exists and another definition exists and it's another thing you need to remember. But I think that is much better than using the term open source and potentially muddying the definition of that term even more. So source first software will 1. Allow users to see the source code of all of our software. 2. Ensure that you can modify the source code for your own use and redistribute it. These are pretty straightforward things that I don't think anybody's gonna argue with if you support free software or open source. 3. Ensure that our software is not limited to use by a particular organization. I wasn't sure what this one meant, so I got it clarified by Michael. Basically, this means that the idea of these source-available internal licenses just would not be possible under this standard. So you couldn't have a system like where Microsoft has, where you can get access to the Word source code, but it's only allowed to be distributed within that organization. Demand that any client we release that requires a server also releases the server software under principles as free as the client software. There is a lot of software out there which only functions if the server is available, and if the servers go down, the software is dead. This, I think, is a really good approach, and any well-made open source software should have been doing this anyway. 5. Avoid the integration of crypto scams. Now, they're aware that this is really weird phrasing, and in their full, proper write-up, this is not going to be here, and is going to be properly structured. Because generally, you don't know something is a scam until it becomes a scam. So unless this was supposed to mean no crypto full stop, it just doesn't make any sense. reject the customer is the product as a business model. This is referring to things like including advertising and unwanted telemetry, where you're just collecting data for the sake of collecting data. And I think that all of us are going to agree that, yeah, that's reasonable. Most crucially, however, source-first software will not force programs to let others, especially the tech oligopoly, profit from their work for free. Ultimately, the community has spoken and likes what we're doing. Not necessarily the entire developer community, but the users. They like that we fund consumer-facing software projects like Image that will beat Google Photos and iCloud. That is a very, very hopeful statement, but hey, I wish you the best of luck. They like that we've donated millions to non-profits. They don't like that we've used the term open source. As stated above, neither OSI nor anyone else owns that term. Culturally, however, the community does own that term and has a right to dictate how it should be used. We accept that, so we've changed our branding accordingly and hope that clears up any misinterpretation about our intentions going forward. And that is the big issue, right? Because when they were using the term open source, I brought this up in my first video, there's a concept known as open washing, where you have something that is not actually open source. Usually it's a proprietary company doing something where it's source available, or maybe they are misusing a license and they call it open source because open source sounds great for branding, but in reality, it was absolutely not. That was not the intention here. It's more of a misguided initial approach. This is all an experiment. In the end, it comes down to this. If we create software that doesn't abuse the public, will people pay for it? Will programmers quit working for Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft and decide to work on good software instead? That is our goal. This is what we want to achieve. We need your help and your feedback to reach that goal. Getting people once again used to paying for software is going to be difficult. Even on Linux, this is the way that it often used to work. There was a period where you would commonly pay for a Linux distro. That sort of all went away with Ubuntu and their whole free CD service, but before that, you would commonly pay, and even outside of the open source space, you would have things like shareware and freeware, which would often be shared around, and then you would pay for a full version of that software, and that was a common thing to happen. So getting back to that state isn't impossible, but it's certainly going to require a bit of work. Now, I don't think the idea of getting completely free software should go away. There are certain people out there who just cannot afford to pay or just don't have the ability to pay. They're a child and they want access to software, but outside of those cases, in the cases where you actually can afford to pay, I would like to see it more common that people support the software they actually like. We can say free software means free as in freedom, not free as in beer, as much as we want, but there is definitely this cultural barrier where some people don't think they should be paying for free software, who don't think they should be paying for open source software. And again, if you don't want to, that's okay, but I think and I hope we can move into a better state. But what do you guys think? Do you think there's a problem here? Do you think it just doesn't matter whatsoever? And are you a developer? I would love to know. If you liked the video, go like the video. And if you really liked the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe, silly barrel pay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and what software do you support? Like this.